I think fundamentally, like the promise of the AggLayer is like, you actually don't have to do that stuff because the liquidity is already there. And so you can focus solely on building your new DeFi primitive or your game, and you can tap into liquidity and marketplaces that already exist.
All right, everyone. Before we get into the episode today, I want to talk a bit about Access Protocol. They're built on Solana and solving the subscription problem in a crypto native way. We'll talk more about them later in the show. Before we get moving on today's episode, just a quick disclaimer. The views expressed on this podcast by either myself, my co-host, or any guests are their personal views and do not represent the views of any associated organization. Nothing in the episode should be construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or any other advice. Okay, let's jump into the episode. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Lightspeed. We've got a great episode lined up for you today with Polygon. We're joined by Brendan, the co-founder and co-lead of Polygon Zero, and Marc, the CEO of Polygon Labs. Guys, thank you both a ton for joining us. As you know, we are a little bit of a Solana-focused podcast, so we love to bring the L2 teams on here just to talk about how, you know, the other side of the streets pushing the industry forward, and you guys are doing a ton of very interesting work on the ZK side of things. So I think a lot of our conversation will probably center around the latest developments there, but I think it's really helpful context for the listener just to give us the quick 1-2 on the history of Polygon. You know, you guys have been around since, honestly, you're quite old in this industry, and that's not something you get to say all the time. I think the POS chain launched in 2022. So Marc, maybe I'll toss this over to you, and if you could just speed run us through the evolution of Polygon, and then kind of explain what your current vision on the end state of Polygon is.
Sure. And thanks for having us. Very excited to be here. So I'll try to keep it short because, as you said, the history is pretty long. But Polygon was kind of thought of through like late 2017, early 2018. And, you know, at that time, really, we didn't have the same technology that we have today, right? And so the bottom line was there was a desire to scale Ethereum, but how Ethereum would ideally be scaled was not abundantly clear at the time. And so what we ended up doing was ended up launching what we refer to as Polygon POS. This is really a chain that the best way to look at it is it's like a side chain. And it's a side chain that was there when I would say Ethereum needed something that was incredibly cheap and incredibly fast. Didn't necessarily inherit the security of Ethereum, but I think it was something that ended up being very helpful for Ethereum from a scalability perspective. And we saw that really through like DeFi summer. And eventually what you saw was like a ton of activity on Polygon POS. And at that time, the founders looked at things and said, okay, well, we're scaling, but like this really can't be the end state of scaling. We need to do something better. And so they looked around and they thought, okay, well, ZK technology really is going to be what we need to scale. And they went ahead and acquired 2 companies at the time, one of which was a company that Brendan co-founded, which was referred to as Mert Protocol at the time. We now refer to it as Polygon Zero internally. And then the second one was a team that we refer to as Polygon Hermes. And these are both stellar kind of ZK teams that are building some of the most advanced ZK technology in the world. And the understanding was we're going to have to evolve from where we've been at. Now, at the same time, what we had was we were seeing insane growth. And on the business side, there was a decision that was like, you know what, right now might be the time where we really see kind of mass adoption kind of throughout the world on blockchains. In hindsight, the reality is that was probably a little early. But what you did see, though, was a lot of traction, right? And these are things that like Polygon became known for, was things like kind of Starbucks and the Nikes and deals of that sort that ended up bringing, frankly, a ton of users to Polygon. Really the bet there being that Web2 companies are going to evolve with time. You know, they start out being like, hey, we'll just put this little thing on chain. But then with more and more time, they start putting more and more on chain. And we're actually starting to see this play out. But eventually what we did was we said, okay, well, now we're ready with the ZK tech much faster than we thought. And we launched what we refer to as Polygon ZKVM, which is a full kind of layer 2 rollout. And this is a protocol that, frankly, people still know us for Polygon POS, even though we do have a full kind of L2 out there. And then from there, we said, okay, we believe that the future is going to be multi-chain with many rollups that are and other L2s. that are going to be needed out there. And so we created what we refer to as the Polygon CDK, which is the chain development kit. And that basically allows for chains to be spun up very, very easily. The last thing that I'll say before kind of stopping this is to say that we don't think that this like fragmented rollup is like a reality that can last for too long. You ultimately need to bring that together. And we do that through what we refer to as aggregated blockchains. It's the idea of taking modular kind of blockchains that can end up being spun up very easily and aggregating them together. We do it through something we refer to as the AggLayer. And that's something that we can kind of dig into now. And that's really where we're at now, where we've got kind of multiple chains, with the future being what we view as thousands of new chains being spun up, mostly as app chains, and that are all going to be aggregated together.
Cool. So just to recap, you guys were super early. In fact, probably the earliest that I can think of, or one of the earliest. You launched with the POS, the proof of stake chain, which most people maybe confused with the L2, and they'll say, well, it's not true L2. It's like, well, yeah, it's not. It's literally a POS chain. And then you also have a ZK chain and also a CDK for launching new chains. And then now basically you're saying it's not great that the future of rollups could lead to this much fragmentation. So why don't we aggregate it and make it unified with the new AggLayer? Okay, so how exactly does the AggLayer work? Like, what are the fundamentals, the blocking and tackling here? Where exactly, like, how exactly do you achieve this, and why haven't people done it before?
The way that I conceptualize the AggLayer is like it has two components. So the first component is the thing that we build, and it's basically this decentralized service that aggregates proofs and like proves something very specific about the Polygon ecosystem. It proves that when chains accept cross-chain messages at lower latency than Ethereum, that those messages are like consistent. So I guess to take a step back, like if you think about what it takes for L2s to communicate trustlessly on Ethereum, like let's say that I have Polygon ZK, I have some funds on Polygon ZKVM and I want to move them and do something on Arbitrum. So what I would have to do in order to do that trustlessly is I would have to initiate a withdrawal on Polygon ZKVM. A proof would have to be generated showing that the transactions that led to my withdrawal are valid. And then that proof needs to be posted and verified on Ethereum. And then I have to deposit my funds on Arbitrum. And then that block that contains my deposit needs to be finalized on Ethereum. So if you like add all of that up, it takes like 45 minutes for you to go from one rollup to another. And that's just not like from a UX perspective, from like a technical complexity perspective, that's just not like a viable way to build like an internet scale crypto ecosystem. I think like, you know, the Solana partisans have like maybe pointed that out a couple times. But so the idea is with the AggLayer, we can say, okay, we're going to allow two rollups to exchange messages either asynchronously or they could accept synchronous bundles of transactions that execute atomically. And we're basically going to allow them to prove or to commit to the messages that they receive or to the bundles that they receive. And we're going to give them a cryptographic guarantee that the state of their rollup can only be settled to Ethereum if the sort of states that they depend on or the bundles that they depend on are valid and execute successfully. And so, so you can think about, to make it more concrete, you can think about if you have like rollup A and rollup B, and rollup B accepts an asynchronous message from rollup A, then rollup B commits to the state that produced that message of rollup A. And so if A equivocates or if it fails to produce a proof, then rollup B will be safe from being settled on Ethereum with like an inconsistent state. And so the sort of the AggLayer you can think of as like the first component provides a cryptographic guarantee that we can safely interoperate at lower latency than Ethereum finality. And we can have all of these rollups share a bridge. So they can fundamentally share the same deposit contract, and they can move L1 native and L2 native assets across the Polygon ecosystem or across the ecosystem that is powered by the AggLayer sort of seamlessly and easily. And so that's sort of like the underlying foundation that makes this possible. And then what's built on top is like what we call like this emergent coordination infrastructure. So that could be shared sequencers, it could be relays, it could be like builders that are building cross rollup blocks. And so those are fundamentally built by other projects in the ecosystem. Like there are a lot of shared sequencer projects that are launching and are planning to build on Polygon. And so that's sort of how I conceptualize the AggLayer, is like this underlying guarantee of cryptographic safety. And then this like emergent infrastructure that allows chains to basically choose the trade-offs and choose how they interoperate. But fundamentally, they can do it at lower than Ethereum latency.
All right, quick break from the episode here to talk to you about Access Protocol, the easiest and best way to stay updated on what's happening in crypto by following your favorite publishers. You can gain access to over 60 publishers, including CoinGecko, CryptoSlate, and a whole list of independent creators. Most importantly, you can also do this without managing a bunch of different subscriptions. We all know how painful that can be. So how it works is you find your favorite publishers, you stake the ACS token, that's the access token, and once you stake, you gain access to all of that creator's content without the hassle of ads or subscriptions that you can't cancel or lose track of how many you have. Access Protocol already has over 225,000 users that are finding new creators, reading content, and even receiving NFTs from their favorite creators. They're soon releasing V2, so check it out, the link in the description to go give the protocol a try. It's an awesome product, it's crypto native, and it's built on Solana. All right, back to the episode. Awesome. That's great context there. And there's a lot of different directions we can take this from here. But I think let's start with sort of this like richer bridging that gets enabled by the AggLayer. So this is a huge unlock. I completely agree with you. And you wrote a blog post, I think it was last month, where you had two claims. One I think there's absolutely no debate around, and then the other one I think is the fun debate here. But the former of those is you said that scaling blockchains is actually just scaling access to liquidity and shared state. I think that's like a fundamental truth of this industry. And this is your solution to that. So I want to dive into exactly what is needed to create this seamless bridging, right? So let's say you were transferring like an L1 asset, so something that's not native to a rollup, but like say like ETH the asset. What is needed to go from rollup A to rollup B in this transfer of ETH? Like in terms of like you would need the same shared bridge contract, the same prover circuits, and then do you need the same DA layer? Can you kind of dive into the technical side of what's required here?
Yeah, so really good question. So I would take like one step back and say that like one of the fundamental things that we want to achieve at Polygon is the ability to use like heterogeneous execution environments. So it's not just the EVM; it could be an arbitrary VM that's written in Rust and compiled and run on a ZK VM like SP1. It could be Polygon Miden. It could be like a type 1 or a type 2 prover. And so this is actually really dangerous because it means that like if we're admitting a bunch of different provers into the ecosystem, then if we aren't careful, we get weakest link security. Because if any of those provers or like if any shit chain is like launching their own prover that has like some minor change and that prover is unsound, then that could jeopardize all of the funds that are in this shared bridge. And so that would be like a disastrous outcome for the Polygon ecosystem or the AggLayer ecosystem. And so what we want to do with the AggLayer is we basically want to ensure that even if a prover or an execution environment is unsound in the AggLayer ecosystem, that it can't drain the bridge. It can only drain the funds that are sort of deposited to it. And so like one thing that the AggLayer proves cryptographically with zero-knowledge proof is that like balances across chains are conserved. And so you could have like some amount of ETH that's on Polygon ZKVM, and you could want to transfer it to like the future upgraded Polygon ZKPOS or the OKX chain or something. And so the user or the UX property that we want to provide is that I can take my ETH on ZKVM and I can bridge and I can get ETH on the OKX chain. And like what enables this is the fact that all of the ETH that's in this ecosystem is collateralized on the L1. And so we're not like, we don't need to do like like an escrow and mint where like I'm like locking my ETH on zkVM and I'm getting some wrapped synthetic on the OKX chain. But fundamentally, like what allows this to be safe is the fact that the AggLayer is checking to ensure that like no chain is able to drain more than the deposited ETH on that chain. And so this is like a subtle point, but it's really, really important to be able to enable like a heterogeneous environment of many execution layers. And, you know, like we see this as being super, super important for the future development of the AggLayer.
So, excuse my ignorance here because I haven't read too much on this except for the actual like announcement and the what you guys put up there. How exactly does DA work? Like, where's the data published here? And also, how does value accrual work? Like, when I'm transferring between these rollups, what token am I using?
The DA question is easy. Like the DA is navigated by each individual chain. So you could have a rollup, or you could have a Validium, or you could have like something that uses Celestia or EigenLayer for DA. I'm not sure I quite follow the second question. Do you just mean like, do you have to pay some other, like, do you have to pay like Polygon tokens or whatever to transfer your ETH? So no. So you would just pay on the origin chain to transfer, and then you might have to pay on the destination chain to claim your ETH. But there's no like, and I think that this can be like a much larger discussion. But like for us, like we don't view it being the right strategy to be like value extractive or to focus on value capture with the AggLayer. Like we're fundamentally trying to build neutral infrastructure that can grow into like a huge ecosystem. I think this is like sort of fundamentally at odds with what a lot of other L2 ecosystems are currently doing, frankly. But we think it's the right approach to focus on like not kind of creating like an extractive or rent-seeking dynamic for Polygon, because I just don't think that those mechanisms can survive long term, and like certainly they won't survive or be conducive to the ecosystem that we want to build.
And Marc, doubling down on that kind of like DA question, the reason why it doesn't matter at all and why we can leave it to like chains to decide what DA they want to use is precisely because of what Brendan was explaining earlier around that like accounting per chain, meaning chains can make their own choices as to how they want to be designed. They can have their own kind of security parameters, which includes like DA, which is relevant to security, censorship resistance, things of that nature. And if they choose like a DA that is like, let's call it like low level, they can still go ahead and create issues for their chain and the users on their chain, as each chain should frankly have a right to decide what they want to, like how they want to build things. The thing that the AggLayer does, though, is it makes sure that those choices, including like DA choices, don't infect other chains that are using the AggLayer. They stay kind of restricted to that chain, and therefore users have the risk of that chain, but never the risk of any other chains on the AggLayer.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes more sense. So on the value accrual question. So okay. So you guys obviously the rollup can pay in its own tokens to on the source chain and also on the destination chain. How do you guys make any sort of income from this? Like, what is your economics or incentives here? Is it just to make one of your rollups the best or one of the best rollups among this ecosystem, or is there something else?
So I think it's two things. I think that so when chains submit batches and proofs to the AggLayer, there will be a nominal fee that will be charged, and because the AggLayer is run by Polygon staked validators for now, that will be yield on staked Polygon. But I think that fee will actually be nominal, and I think for me the more compelling argument for value accrual is the fact that like if we have this ecosystem where liquidity is shared and users are shared and we have access to shared state, then if a chain wants to join that ecosystem, it's like fundamentally a positive sum interaction, right? It's like a win-win, because if that chain has economic value, whether in the form of like an NFT mint or a cool DeFi primitive or some game, then it's adding value and contributing value to the Polygon ecosystem. And in return, it's getting access to liquidity and users and like, the applications that already exist in the ecosystem. And so I think fundamentally, like, it's sort of a mistake to focus on being extractive or to drive a bunch of value to Polygon, because like, I think that we can create this flywheel where, for an application developer or for a chain builder, it just makes sense to be part of this ecosystem. I think like growing the pie and creating like the maximal set of like liquidity and apps and users in crypto is sort of the end game for us, even if it doesn't mean that we capture like a super meaningful percentage of the overall like economic value or GDP in the ecosystem. I don't know, Marc, if that's your view, but.
Yeah, no, I think that last point is the key, right? I'd say that like previously we had thought, and I think everyone kind of thinks like this initially, is like, hey, we're going to build like the big thing that is going to eat, everything else. Or in the Ethereum ecosystem, it's like the L2 that'll be like the L2 on top of like Ethereum. And I think like the thing that we realized is that like in a kind of like the aggregated blockchains world, that's really not like the right attitude. It's not the right approach. And that really we should be thinking of it as like, let's grow a huge pie. And we can just have a slice of that pie. Like, that's totally fine. Like, why do we need to be that whole pie? For two reasons, right? Like the frank reason is you're probably not going to win by trying to be that whole pie. It's probably going to be very hard. And the second part is like everyone can do fine just being a small part of that pie. And so that's really kind of like the thought process as to why like the economics that Brendan laid out kind of makes sense from our perspective, rather than trying to just grab everywhere where we can some bit of economics and try to grow something huge for kind of Polygon.
So let's talk about what it would take to get another chain into the AggLayer, right? So let's say it's I don't want to use an example of an existing chain just because there's no point in like bringing other names into it, but like, let's say there's Rollup A that has a large TVL. It's been around for a couple of years, and they're like, you know what? We've built this great framework. We really like our VM, but Polygon's crushing it, and we want to get in on this AggLayer. It benefits everyone. It brings our users closer to other chains and vice versa. We want to join the AggLayer, but they have like this large bridge contract that already exists. Like, what does that transition like look like to get them into the AggLayer?
Yeah, so from a technical perspective, they would want to migrate their L1 native assets to the shared bridge for the AggLayer. But beyond that, I mean, like let's say for the sake of argument that they're an optimistic rollup, we recently released a Type 1 prover that allows any existing EVM chain to immediately become a ZK rollup or a ZK L2. And so I think the migration pathway is actually pretty straightforward. And again, for them, like, I get that there are sort of narrative considerations and there are reasons why they wouldn't want to be seen as joining Polygon's thing, but we're really trying to make the AggLayer neutral infrastructure. And for them, like, it's purely a win-win, because if they believe genuinely that they're offering a better and more compelling experience for users and developers, like, that's great. They now have access to all of the Polygon users and all the liquidity that's in the Polygon ecosystem. And so, like, I wouldn't be surprised if we see more instances of this where existing rollups decide that, it like the AggLayer truly is like credibly neutral infrastructure, and it just makes sense to join and to participate in this growing ecosystem.
Yeah, and one of the cool things, right, is like when you think of that rollup, for example, that decides to join the AggLayer, there really is no downside. And the reason for that is because if they've created the best user experience, all of that execution will remain within that rollup anyway, right? If you have like the deepest liquidity, you acquire the user, then that user is going to transact and it's going to get executed within that rollup itself or within that chain itself. It's never going to even use the AggLayer. The only situation in which it's going to use the AggLayer is one of two. Either there's deeper liquidity on another chain, thereby resulting in a better like execution price for the user, or the part that not many people are thinking about is there's a user on another chain that actually can get deeper liquidity on that chain. Right. So there's a user, right? You plug in, you say, hey, I've got the best execution environment and the best liquidity only users on my chain want to use my chain. Cool, but what about this user on this other chain that got there through whatever means it might be, and they're looking for liquidity? They think they're going to get it on that chain that they just came through, but they actually get it on the chain that actually kind of just joined, thinking that it had the best kind of execution environment and liquidity. That is something that ends up just, again, being a win-win, because whether you're getting the users or retaining the liquidity, or your users using your liquidity, there's really no harm to joining the AggLayer, because you just get the best of both worlds. And I can't really see a scenario in which you end up being worse off from joining it.
Okay, so going to play devil's advocate. So assume I am one of these bigger rollups, right? So like an Arbitrum, Optimism, or whatever. And so, I mean, I think you're both directionally correct in the long term that this is some incredibly neutral protocol, and it's for actually the best interest of everybody, right? Ultimately speaking. Now, there are short-term incentives, and people maybe over-index on those in this industry specifically. And so that is to say, I can imagine a case where they're like, okay, but like, why am I letting Polygon kind of take control of this with their ZK proofs, and now their validators, I have to rely on them in a sense at first. And also the other aspect of this is narrative, right? Like it's like, okay, now Polygon is doing this, and now my alignment looks weird, let's say, and my name isn't out there in the front like it used to be. So I guess, like, how do you think about that? Do you think, because there's like a weird competitive but also collaborative dynamic that I'm not quite sure how to capture, because those people might also want to do the same thing, right? If they think it's a good idea. So I guess, like, one, how do you think about that? And then two, on like the other side of the aisle, there's things like Near, who's working on like chain abstraction, who maybe directionally this is somewhat similar, obviously not the exact same thing. So I guess, just curious to get your high level thoughts on those two competitive dynamics.
Maybe I'll start with the first one, and then Marc, the second one, and then Marc, you can jump in on the first. So I think that chain abstraction is like a really cool conceptual framework for looking at solving some of these issues. The way that I would describe it is that chain abstraction sort of approaches things from the front end. So it's looking at like, how do we do multi-chain wallets? How do we do like intents and solving and sort of like set up the user and developer experience for a multi-chain environment that can make it feel like a single chain. And the AggLayer is fundamentally like looking at the back end. It's like, how do we build infrastructure that can allow people to do all of this safely? And so I think that those visions are actually really compatible. And I think that they are even complementary. And so I think that like a lot of the work that's being done on the front end and the DevX and the UX side will be directly applicable to the AggLayer ecosystem. And I think that those two things will work really well together. I think that we'd already announced that Near will be joining the AggLayer. And so I think that this is like the first step for like a lot of L1s that are not in the Ethereum ecosystem to join and participate in the Ethereum ecosystem to sort of share liquidity and get access to all the good stuff that's happening in Ethereum. But Marc, I don't know if you have a good answer to the narrative pressure in the short term.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good question. You just started touching on this a little bit, which is, I think, look, there's going to be multiple steps to this. I think the first part is always like the hard part, right? Which is, how do you get like first movers to come on and join, especially when there's a competitive dynamic? That's like the first stage that I'll come back to in a second. The second stage is one that I would say people start joining because they feel like they need to for competitive reasons, which is maybe when network effects have already kicked in, or when it is apparent that network effects will kick in. And so coming back to that first point, I will say, frankly, that I've been genuinely surprised at the willingness of L1s to come join the AggLayer, and you'll hear more about this in like coming months. And I think it was because my initial thought wasn't, I would say, like neutral enough, maybe in how I was thinking about it. And it was like, okay, they're all going to look at this narrative and be like, okay, we're joining an L2 with the AggLayer. What's this going to sound like? But the reality is that they're not. They're still L1s. They can still have their own consensus. Ultimately, all they're doing is plugging into the AggLayer and sharing in this like liquidity that exists on Ethereum and on other kind of rollups. And so from their perspective, they don't need to let go of that like L1 narrative. Like that they will actually still be L1s. That is the reality. But they are just now getting access to kind of the Ethereum ecosystem in a way that they did not have access to before. And so that's been something that actually been very, very well received. As for, direct competitors, look, the bottom line is like no direct competitor is going to be like, yes, please let me join this thing that Polygon built and be part of it. That being said, I think Brendan did touch on some things that I think are very compatible with them doing that, and why it's not as absurd as it might seem, even in these initial stages, which is, we're really providing this layer of security. And ultimately, on top of that, there are things that some of these other chains are working on that are very compatible with that, one of which is shared sequencing. And so we don't need, as we were saying earlier, we don't need to own everything. We don't need to be the one who provides the shared sequencing in addition to the security. So if one of these like roll-up says, hey, we want to provide this shared sequencing so that we can have this great cross-chain composability and experience, but we need security, we'll say, okay, great. Well, you can get security with the AggLayer, and you can still have the economics that you want and the shared ecosystem that you ultimately want to have. And whether that happens in initial stages or not, I think we will see. I think with time, when network effects do build up, I think it'll be a much easier choice to have to make, even if they don't end up making up in these early stages.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because, at the end of the day, there will be other competitors that, make their own equivalent of what the AggLayer is. And they're like, I feel like we've heard them talked about as constellations, right? You'll have like this, the Polygon AggLayer with its chains on top of it that can all intercommunicate. And then, like the ZK Sync prover circuit system, or maybe the Scroll or so on. There are other teams building these ZK solutions. And do you kind of expect there to be these like constellations, I'll keep using that word, of these chains that can all interconnect, and then there's still like the friction, they're still bridging friction between those constellations, but at least, there is the improvement that once you're within these ecosystems, it becomes very easy to interact. Is that kind of how you see this unfolding?
Yeah, I think in the short and medium term, but I think like Marc said, I think network effects will be really powerful. And if you think about like the marginal builder or like the new entrant who's building or launching a chain, it's going to be a really easy decision to join an ecosystem where there's the most liquidity and where there are no requirements that they, split sequencing fees with, some other ecosystem, or like, I think that those will increasingly be seen as sort of onerous. And like, if you think about the developer, the builder perspective, like right now, if you're launching a chain, you have to do you have to build your app or your NFT collection or your game, but you also have to do like a lot of other stuff that maybe you don't want to do that much or enjoy, and that's things like bootstrapping liquidity, like playing with games with liquidity mining incentives and airdrops, and like doing all this stuff that's fundamentally been replicated across like a bunch of different L2s. And so I think fundamentally like the promise of the AggLayer is like you actually don't have to do that stuff because the liquidity is already there. And so you can focus solely on building your new DeFi primitive or your game or your NFT collection, and you can tap into liquidity and marketplaces that already exist. And so I think that will be like a really, really powerful selling point, especially if you don't have to do things like, pay sequencing fees or do like revenue shares or like submit to like the governance of another chain. And so I just think that like in the long run, the network effects around a particular ecosystem will kind of make really compelling choices for builders.
So there are basically three, let's say, approaches to blockchain scaling, I would say, or paths, let's say, to the end game. There's obviously the one that our viewers will be familiar with, which is bigger L1s and maybe a few of them. There's also the one where there's actually a few L2s, like maybe 2 or 3 L2s that kind of dominate most of the traffic. In fact, I believe Ryan, who was actually on the podcast before, he believed that when he came on. And then there's obviously the one where there's many rollups, tens, hundreds. It seems like you guys probably believe much more in the many rollups thesis, hence why aggregation layer. I guess the fundamental question is why do you guys believe that the future will be that many rollups as opposed to, maybe like a more classical Pareto dynamics from traditional industries where like 3 kind of people in each industry dominate most of that market?
Yeah, so I think that the sort of like answer to this question depends on what you view the end state of crypto to be. And if you're optimistic about the eventual throughput that's required and the eventual capacity, then I think that leads you to sort of a different answer. And so I think that there are many like reasonable views on what like crypto ends up looking like. I think like Anatoly, who I've like a lot of respect for, like to be clear, has argued that in the end state you sort of need as much throughput as like maybe NASDAQ or you're not looking at like millions or billions of transactions. You're probably topping out at around like 100 or 200K. I think that that's like a really reasonable view of like where crypto ends up, and it's still like a very, very optimistic view relative to where we are now. But it's not my view. I think that if you need if you look at what you need for internet scale crypto, you need 2 things. You need like basically the ability to horizontally scale. So to add capacity to meet demand, even as that demand grows like super, super big. And you also need the ability to accommodate heterogeneous requirements in terms of like security and user experience and latency and decentralization and like all of these things that sort of like fit different applications in different ways. And so I think like one way that I would put it is like, if you look at Solana, which like, to be clear, is like an amazing feat of engineering. I like a ton of respect. Like, I think the Solana team is like doing like some of the best work in the space. And like that approach to vertical scaling is going to be used by many, many different teams. And like Solana will like continue to be a really, really important part of the industry. But I think it doesn't really make sense for like a game on Solana to be paying for the same block space as like a CLOB or an AMM or like a DeFi lending market. And I know that you can get around this a little bit with local fee markets and parallelism and like there are ways that you can mitigate this impact, but you still run into shared resources and like the requirement of validators to download like all of the transactions that are happening in some game. And I think that the many rollups approach is like a really, really interesting one. It's a compelling one because it solves basically both of these issues where we can always add capacity to meet demand as it grows. And we can give like different experiences and different trade-offs to different applications that demand it. I think that will just like continue to be true where like the requirements for DeFi will just be different from crypto gaming or from like an NFT mint. And so I think it's really important to be able to accommodate all those things.
Yeah, maybe the one thing that I'd add to that is just double down on like what kind of chains, when you're looking at like thousands of chains, you'd expect to see, right? And like we would not expect to see many general purpose chains. Like I think the idea that you're going to see like a massive number of general purpose chains is like very unlikely. But what we would expect to see is applications saying, I want to control my environment for all the reasons Brendan mentioned. And as a result of that, I would like to have my own block space. And those are the ones that are going to spin up in the thousands, because frankly, there's millions of applications that already exist today. Not every application deserves to be on a blockchain. I know some people would disagree with that, but I don't think that's necessary. But many of them will make sense to be on a blockchain. And when they do, they're going to want to control that environment that they are in. And that is what kind of a roll up or just L2 in general is going to allow them to do in a way that they can't fully do. They can do a lot of it, right? Like, let's not like overemphasize. Like, there's a lot of things that you can do on Solana or a different L1 in terms of like making a unique experience for your users. But being able to create like a fully unique experience that you control, and that those users are going to get like the same experience. Basically, they expect like off-chain is something that seems like unlikely if you're not kind of in a world of many separate kind of rollups.
Yeah, and I think to be clear, a few things like the Tully's vision of maybe 100 to 200K TPS. I do think he does think it'll be like reaching 1 million at some point, but I don't think that's actually the point. I think like what many people don't understand is these are not really mutually exclusive, right? Like people who require super low latency shared block space will obviously use Solana. And if there is something better than Solana, then they'll use that, obviously. It just depends on which segment of the market you're using. I actually do agree on the gaming example. Like if I'm a game with my own block space, it's not super clear to me why I would use Solana, honestly, just because it's like, I mean, currently it's pretty good, but in the future when all the L2s start getting better, it's like, why do I really need a shared L1 for this? So I think it'll really depend on which use cases end up dominating the market. And so I actually like playing the game of guessing the use cases. And so I do want to ask, kind of a weird segue, but you guys have a few different products, right? So you guys have obviously the AggLayer now, which seems to be the main one, but you also have ZK rollups and SDKs and Polygon Avail, right? You have a DA layer, and I believe there was SuperNet. I'm not sure if that's technically a part of one of these. What do you like? Okay, so I'm thinking if I'm a CEO of Polygon, that's a lot of different focus areas. Okay, how do I like allocate resources effectively to ensure the probability of success for the company there?
Given that I'm the CEO, I get to take that question. Look, the answer is it's tough, and you need to make sure that you focus. What I would say transparently is I think we ventured into doing too many things, and we've spun off some stuff, right? So Polygon Avail, for example, that DA layer is no longer with Polygon. We spun it off, and it is no longer with us. We announced that we will be spinning off Polygon ID, which is a ZK-based identity solution. Similarly, we had Polygon Ventures, an in-house ventures arm that we spun off. So all of this comes down to being able to focus on the core things that we do well. And the core things that we do well is ZK tech. And so that's what you'll see at the center of all of it. So when you kind of go from there and you say, okay, what are you really focused on? Well, the answer is really two things. It's Polygon CDK and it is the AggLayer. Those are the core things. Now, then you say, okay, but you've got some other things out there. You've got Polygon POS that is in production. You've got Polygon ZK EVM that is in production. And then you've got Polygon Maiden, which is going on testnet soon. Why do you have those three things? There's two reasons for them. First is they will all be ZK based. So Polygon POS will be upgrading to be what we'll refer to as a ZK POS. It'll be kind of a ZK powered chain. The core components that make up POS will become part of Polygon CDK. The ZK VM, many of those components are already part of Polygon CDK. Maiden VM will become part of Polygon CDK. At the core, we will just have Polygon CDK and the AggLayer. And all we'll have when it comes to why even keep, well, POS, we couldn't choose to keep around or not keep around, even if we wanted to. But why would we spin up Maiden? Why would we spin up ZK VM? And the simple reason is people like to see these things in production. So if you're like, hey, should I build using Polygon CDK? And you have a chain that has been built with certain components of it, you can see what it does. Same thing with Polygon Maiden. Now, on top of that, all three of these have very different attributes. They're completely different. And it kind of shows a little bit why it is that you build kind of different chains with different things. Like Maiden, for example, is going to have what we refer to as client-side proving. It will, Mert, you'll disagree with this, but having spent a lot of time at DYDX on order book DEXs, I can say this. I think it'll be literally the place to build an order book DEX. Because of that client-side proving allows you to create and cancel orders on your own device in a way that literally doesn't even take up any block space. It allows for privacy. So some really cool things there. But the short answer to this is all of these will be ZK based. There will be models of what Polygon CDK is in production, and AggLayer is the other piece of it. So it really, we've done it intentionally to really focus and bring it down, because you're right, we were doing too many things.
Okay, so that's a good segue, because basically the future direction of Polygon or identity is ZK. Okay. Now, currently, the two biggest L2s are optimistic, and in fact, one of them does not have proofs. In fact, the multisig is anonymous.
Which one doesn't have proofs?
Optimism does not have proofs. Okay, and I think Arbitrums is permissioned. I could be wrong on that.
It's
Okay.
permission, but they have a cold solution.
Yeah.
Can I jump in on that? Because I think a lot of people don't realize that like the ideal, like the security model for optimistic rollups is that anyone in the world can run a node and can detect fraud and submit a fraud proof. And so if you have a permission set of validators that can and only they can submit fraud proofs, like from a safety perspective, the security of your chain sort of starts looking a lot like a side chain because you have this fixed set of validators that can collude to steal everyone's funds. So just sorry to interrupt and sorry for
yeah, no, I mean that's basically, yes, correct. That is a concern. And given that is a concern, first of all, why is this the case that the industry is in this state, and why are we okay with it? And two, why would something I have a hard time understanding, or I mean, you kind of speculate as to why, but why somebody like a Coinbase would go with something that doesn't really have proofs live in production, and then we start getting into alignment and politics. And you guys obviously you are much closer to the ground, and obviously, you can probably not say certain things. You can say certain things. I can just do whatever I want because I'm on an L1. But so what are your high level? What is your mental model for thinking about the state of optimistic rollups today? It's quite clear that the future will be ZK, but we still kind of have this weird middle state here. So how do you guys think about this?
Do you want me to take that, Marc?
Yeah, you can. I'll have additional thoughts, but you can. I know you've got some spicy thoughts on this, and Marc has some spicy thoughts. So let's give him some spicy thoughts.
I mean, I can't get too spicy, but I do think that there is a sense in which, like on the one hand, I think users really care about good UX and good DevX, and I think that optimistic rollups were faster to market. You can argue that it's because they made compromises around security that ZK rollups did not make. But I think that they being live for a longer period of time gives them, or has given them, the ability to offer better UX and better DevX. I do think in the medium term, all of the execution level stuff, all the proofs and sort of the ZK technology will be commoditized. Our type 1 prover is open source. Anyone can use it. I expect that there will be further technological improvements that will allow other projects to onboard to becoming ZKL2s. But I think from our perspective, what we really care about is the AggLayer, because if you assume that all of this execution level technology will become commoditized, then the question is where do network effects accrue, and where can rollups cooperate to drive better positive sum outcomes, and we think that point of coordination will be around the AggLayer. I'm trying to think of something I can say that's spicy but won't be too offensive, and failing a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I think I don't think it makes sense to relitigate the do they have fraud proofs or don't they have fraud proofs. I hope that all chains will in the not so distant future will opt to use zero knowledge proofs and to guarantee a high level of security to their users, because we were just saying, in a ZK rollup, even if proving is permissioned, even if we as the operator are the only people that can generate proofs, the user still has a guarantee that unless the proving system is broken or is unsound, their funds cannot be stolen. And so that's certainly a different guarantee from not having proofs at all, but it's also a different guarantee from having permission fraud proofs. And so I think that as an industry, we to varying degrees, we've done well maybe at the UX and the DevX, but we haven't really been pushing on security as much as maybe we could have.
Yeah. And I think that's the key here, right? Is like, I mean, to be honest, right? Like we've been frustrated at times because we sit here saying, especially like from Polygon's perspective, spent close to $1 billion on ZK tech. And you've got other chains that said, that's okay. Like I'll take a massive shortcut or maybe just a small shortcut to launch faster and create a better experience. And then they acquire a bunch of users, right? Now, fortunately for us, I think the ZK tech developed way faster than anyone expected. And even now, like every iteration is like incredibly fast. Like we continue to look at what others are doing and we're like, oh, this is really impressive. And then we look at what we're doing and we're like, oh, that just beat like everything that we expected from a performance perspective. This is fantastic. And so I think we've been fortunate, frankly, that the ZK tech has evolved as fast as it has. And frankly, it's thanks to teams like Brendan's that have made that happen. But I think at the same time, we need to get to a point where we go back to like what I'll call like crypto roots. Like I got into crypto because of, frankly, the cool things that allows you to do that you don't do in like a Web2 environment in a secure way. And not having that security and just operating like we're in Web 2 is like kind of not really what I was in the industry, got into the industry to do. And I think that, frankly, too many roll-ups, and I hesitate to call them roll-ups at times, because they shouldn't be, have gone into that. And they're basically saying, you know what, we can acquire a bunch of users, a bunch of TVL, and we can launch really quickly and easily without too many problems if we take these shortcuts. And ultimately, I think there's a part of it, and Mert, you do this well, right? Which is like, you've got to take a hard position on folks who are taking those shortcuts. But ultimately, there's more to that, right? There is a community aspect. I think we all probably know, right? Like crypto is, it's social, financial, and technical. And here we're talking about just the technical portion of it. And frankly, the financial portion incentivizes shortcuts. And so really there's this social layer. And I think that some of the chains have done a good job at ingratiating themselves on the social level layer in a way that has given them a pass. And I think that we need to, kindly but properly kind of push back against that, build the technical stuff that allows people to see, hey, we don't need to take these shortcuts. And eventually we'll be to a spot where I think we get back to like the roots of what we're actually trying to build in a way that is actually kind of scalable and unified, but we need to actually get there. So I think that critique, Mert, in terms of where we're at right now is like a good one, frankly, right? Because it's just reality.
I love the pragmatic vision right there. And you said something that intrigued me. So you mentioned the significant sum of money that you and the team have invested into ZK research and development. And that actually triggered a thought is, what does it cost today to run a proving system? And what is the latency you're seeing right now on actually posting proofs? And of course, like there's rapid innovation happening. So that's kind of a hard answer, but I'm curious, like what's in production today?
Yeah, so we released benchmarks for like the type 1. I guess your viewers probably aren't familiar with like Vitalik's ZKVM type classification. And so type 1 is like the most Ethereum or EVM compatible. So you can generate proofs for existing EVM chains. But it's also like the most expensive because the EVM like sucks for ZK operations because it uses Ketrack and NPTs and RLP. And so the benchmarks that we released for like an average Ethereum block, like we generated a bunch of proofs for L1 blocks, and we saw that the average proving cost per transaction is like between 1 and 2/10 of a cent. And so this is before we are upgrading the proving system from what we call Plonky 2 to Plonky 3. It's not the best branding in the world. You guys might do that better on the Solana side, but so that'll lead to like plus some optimizations in terms of like splitting the unit of proving down should make that like 30 to 50x cheaper. And so we should see a latency I would expect of about 30 seconds. Regardless of the complexity of the transaction, because we can break it down into these like sub transaction chunks. And the cost should be, between like a few hundredths to even some hundredth of a cent. So.
And one of the things that I think is really interesting about like the AggLayer that we kind of group as part of it is what we refer to as like proof aggregation. And one of the things there is this is like a question of like generating a proof for a block on like one prover and that cost. What you can really ultimately end up doing, which we will be doing, is amortizing that cost across effectively a bunch of users on a bunch of different chains. And the reason is because when you put one proof onto Ethereum, there's like a fixed cost for that. But what you can do is you can actually take, let's say, 2 different proofs, and you can wrap those proofs in a proof. And then you have another proof that comes in, and you wrap that proof in that whole thing. And then after a while, you put that proof onto Ethereum. And what you end up doing is, notwithstanding like the individual costs being, optimized and super low, the cost of all of those chains in the aggregate proving to Ethereum ends up being distributed amongst all of those users and ends up being tiny compared to even what Brendan was talking about.
Cool. Well, talking about costs, the day after this episode launches will be 4844. And a lot of interesting, predictions about this. People are using, prediction markets to make predictions, which, whatever. And I'm curious what you guys think. Do you think it'll be, a 3x improvement, 100x improvement, as certain podcasters have told me? Or what are your general thoughts on 4844 and maybe AltDA in general?
Yeah, so I think, Mert, I might actually agree with your take that you've made on Twitter, which is that as the price of ETH increases and as demand for blob space increases, like we actually will almost certainly not see a 100x improvement. And so I think in the short term, we should see DA costs come down. But I think in the medium and long term, like the benefit won't be as pronounced as some have claimed. I don't know, Marc, if you have a different take, but I think that the nice thing about ZK systems is that we can run chains in this mode called Validium. And that basically guarantees that like we don't have to put DA on Ethereum or on Celestia or on Avail. We can have a committee that attests that the transaction data is available. And that committee is basically forced by the zero knowledge proof to only process valid transactions, or to only like validly execute transactions. And so there is a risk that the DA committee stops the chain, or that there's some like data withholding attack. But I think if you actually like play out the scenario that under which this would happen, it's like a pretty good security guarantee for a lot of applications. And so I think this is like an advantage of ZK systems, is that you have more flexibility with DA. And so you can still have your DeFi applications and your like large pools of liquidity secured by roll-up DA guarantees. But you can offload a lot of the transactions that don't require that to other chains. So that's, shameless plug for ZK Tech.
Yeah, and Mert, this gets into like your question on like what about alternative DAs, and I'll call myself like a choice maxi over here. Like I like people who have choice for what they want, right? You said it earlier, right? And I fundamentally believe it. Like Solana is going to end up being an extremely big chain that is going to be very successful for a certain set of things. It won't be able to do everything, but there's a set of things that it'll be very, very good to do. And people will use it for that a lot. And then I think there's other things that people will want to do. So gaming was the one that we were talking about earlier that I'll give an example. The economic value in most games is tiny. And therefore the security guarantees that you need in those games are probably equally small. And so when you look at something like DA, you could even see a world in which you've got like local data availability used for certain applications that are extremely low economic value. Then you could go one step higher and say, I want a little more than that. I want a data availability committee. I want a few folks that are going to attest to that data. Or you could go like a layer higher. And all of these get a little more expensive, but could still be very cheap compared to Ethereum. And you get to like the Celestia or the EigenDAs or the near kind of DA. And that gives you even more security. Maybe not Ethereum level security, but more security. Or you could go kind of a level up and now you get Ethereum level security. All of those have different security trade-offs that an app developer should be able to choose. Which level of security do I want to provide to users based on like the economic value that is provided? I could even see a world, interestingly, right, where that like evolves. You actually start with, I talk about this sometimes, like just launch an application on Polygon POS. If you really want to see if there's product market fit, you don't need any, like you just want to see if like users are even interested in this. Like go ahead and just launch. And then if you actually see that there's a lot of interest in what you're building, you don't really require that super unique experience. Then go ahead and say, I'm going to create an even better user experience, right? It's kind of like that launch that MVP and then kind of evolve from there. And then you can go launch your own chain when it actually makes more sense. Same idea here from like the DA perspective, just different trade-offs. And people should have a right to choose what trade-offs they want based on the applications they're building and users that they have.
I love your view on optionality there. I strongly agree that that's kind of one of the beauties of this industry. And I know we're running up on the hour here, so I got one more question for you. You guys made a very explicit choice to migrate the token from Matic to POL. And that is something I applaud. But if you look out in the industry, we're seeing this new trend where the same team will launch multiple tokens, right? It's more on the application layer, I would say, right? Like Velodrome, Aerodrome, Unibot, Unisol, Trader Joe, Merchant Mode, the list goes on. And there are very few teams, although there are some others, that are making the opposite decision where, they're kind of viewing it as we're going to keep building under the same brand and the same token. And that is your decision. The migration had some slight tokenomic changes, which I think is perfectly understandable given the token was launched about 4 years ago and there's a totally new understanding of what a token should do and look like. So I am curious why you guys made the decision to migrate the token instead of kind of like building out a token related to like just the AggLayer and keeping Matic as its own standalone thing related to the POS chain.
Yeah, I can take that. Ultimately, the key here is like why we did it, right? And the reality is we had a token that was non-upgradable. And therefore, you had to upgrade it somehow to do things that we wanted. One of them that we haven't talked about here, and I wouldn't call it a core product. I think like those who are into token economics might care about like the staking hub deeply and what that will allow. But basically one of the things it allows is going to be to allow like decentralizing things like sequencers on these various like CDK chains that launch. And well, there's some economic benefits potentially to doing that. If you look at like the Cosmos ecosystem, every time that you launch a new token, what do you need to a new chain? What do you need to do? You need a super highly inflationary token at the beginning stages, and then hopefully it like flattens out over time as usage increases, so on and so forth. In this case, what you would be able to do is we have like 1% inflation that goes to basically a governance body that can choose how to allocate it, including allocating it to new CDK chains. So what this would allow is effectively for a new CDK chain to launch with like the economic security of a high market cap token and not ever need to roll out its own token, or it rolls out its own token when it actually wants to. And it's ready for it, and the economics actually make sense. And then it rolls off of POL, or it uses kind of POL or Matic for like dual staking purposes. And so we ultimately ended up, let's call it, getting forced to have this new token, but it was always intended to serve the same purpose as that original token. It wasn't intended to serve a new purpose. And so I don't think we really like thought of, hey, we should have a new token because again, it was supposed to serve like the exact same purpose as Matic served in the first place. Matic couldn't be upgraded.
I think that makes total sense. And I think that's probably a good place to end it, unless Mert, you had another question you wanted to jump in here with.
Nope.
All righty, guys. Well, Brendan, Marc, this was a phenomenal discussion and really, I think, gives a very holistic picture at what Polygon is and what it's aiming to do, as well as how it's building towards its end state of the future. So, guys, thanks a ton for joining us, and we will certainly have you back on in the future to discuss future developments. But thanks again, guys. Cheers.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having us.
Cheers.